Imagine being so broke that you have to quietly borrow billions from your worst enemy just to survive long enough for your best friend to pay them off.
Right, which sounds completely
It
ridiculous.
sounds like the plot of a terrible soap opera.
Right.
But that is exactly what is happening to entire nations right now. Because when the bank account hits zero, all the fiery political rhetoric in the world suddenly just, well, it doesn't matter anymore.
It's the ultimate reality check, really, because ideology doesn't pay sovereign debt, and you certainly can't pay for imported food or energy with a political speech.
No, you definitely can't. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. If you've been watching the headlines lately, you might be scratching your head, wondering why the extreme political posturing we see on TV so rarely matches actual government policy.
Yeah, there's a huge disconnect there.
Exactly. So today, we are exploring a central theme for you, which is why cold, hard economics ultimately forces pragmatic collaborations, no matter how intense the geopolitical rivalries get.
We are essentially going to look under the hood of the global economy today. I mean, the surface might look like this chaotic political battlefield, but underneath, the machinery is driven by very practical needs.
Right, like securing energy.
Securing energy, stabilizing currencies, and keeping inflation from just totally destroying local economies.
So to figure out how this machinery actually works, we are drawing from a really diverse stack of sources for this deep dive.
Yep.
We've got geopolitical analyses from the Carnegie Endowment, we have academic studies diving into China's Belt and Road Initiative, and we are mixing all that with real-time financial reporting from SBC TV and Liberal.gr.
And that's all dated right up to today, Monday, July 27, 2026.
Right. And our mission here is to cut through all the political noise and discover how global stability, fluctuating energy prices, and pragmatic diplomacy directly affect your wallet.
Because when you look closely at these sources, you start to see the hidden strings. A diplomatic decision in Washington or a policy shift in Beijing ripples through the supply chains. And that eventually dictates, the cost of electricity in Athens or the value of a paycheck in Buenos Aires.
It's all connected. And just as a quick note before we jump in, we are looking at highly charged figures today. Our sources cover Donald Trump, Javier Milei, and the actions of the governments of China and Iran.
Yeah, heavy hitters.
Very. And we want to be clear, we aren't here to take political sides. We are simply taking the facts, the data, and the ideas exactly as they are presented in the original source material, just to understand the broader economic mechanics at play. So, okay, let's unpack this.
To understand why countries are essentially forced into these pragmatic alliances, we really have to start with the most immediate catalyst causing global economic anxiety today.
Which is?
The absolute direct link between geopolitical volatility and inflation.
And the sources give us a perfect breaking news example of that link. As of today, the U.S. has paused its nearly 2-month campaign of airstrikes against Iran for a third consecutive night.
Right.
And when I read that, my first thought was about the political implications. But the markets reacted instantly, didn't they?
They did. The immediate consequence was this massive global sigh of relief. I mean, we saw Brent crude oil plummet by 7 to 9% in response to this pause.
Wow, just from a pause.
Yeah, dropping down to around $88 to $91 a barrel. And Wall Street futures like the Dow, NASDAQ 100, S&P 500, they all rallied.
Let me stop you there because I want to make sure we understand the mechanism here. Why does a 3-day pause in airstrikes instantly make oil 9% cheaper? I mean, the oil is still in the ground, the ships are still in the ocean. Nothing physically changed about the oil supply overnight.
What's fascinating here is how the market prices in fear. This drop is the evaporation of what economists call the war premium.
War premium.
Yeah. When a conflict erupts near a major energy hub, buyers and speculators assume that future supply might be destroyed or blocked. So they rush to buy oil now, which bids up the price.
Oh, I see.
That premium is essentially an invisible tax added to every single barrel of oil purely based on the fear of what might happen tomorrow. So when the airstrikes paused, that fear subsided and the invisible tax just vanished.
Which is a huge deal for central banks.
Yeah.
It's like taking a heavy foot off the economic brake pedal because central banks have been terrified of energy-driven inflation.
Absolutely terrified.
If oil is expensive, shipping is expensive, manufacturing is expensive, and that means literally everything at the grocery store gets more expensive for you.
And that forces central banks to keep interest rates high to cool down the economy. So cheaper oil means less inflation pressure, which means central banks might actually be able to lower interest rates and let economies breathe.
But looking at the sources, I have to challenge the market's reaction here a bit. Is this sudden relief just a temporary illusion of stability?
Yeah.
Because the underlying conflict hasn't vanished. The U.S. and Iran haven't signed a peace treaty or anything.
No, they haven't, and that is the critical vulnerability here. The root issue is absolutely not solved. Just look at the geography.
Right.
The Strait of Hormuz, which is this maritime choke point where 1/5 of total global oil consumption passes, remains de facto closed by Iran, and the U.S. is demanding it be fully reopened for international navigation.
So while the war premium has momentarily disappeared from the price ticker, the structural threat to the global energy supply is sitting right there, completely unresolved.
Exactly.
So for the listener who might be looking at their investment portfolio today, what is the real takeaway? Because you can't just try to day trade the news of a 3-day ceasefire.
No, definitely not. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it proves that geopolitical volatility is simply the new normal. Markets right now are incredibly fragile. They are pricing in a very delicate diplomatic hope, not concrete conflict resolution.
Right, hoping things don't get worse.
Yeah. And if that strait remains closed, or if hostilities resume tomorrow morning, that war premium on oil will skyrocket right back up. So for investors, this rapid shift from absolute fear to total relief highlights why careful portfolio diversification is the only real defense. You just cannot rely on a single geographical region for stability anymore.
That idea of relying on geography is a perfect pivot. Let's look at how this high-level global energy volatility actually manipulates global supply chains, and by extension, specific local realities.
Yeah, let's get into that.
Because the sources highlight Greece as a fascinating case study in navigating this.
Greece is the perfect example of a nation caught in the crossfire of these huge macroeconomic forces. I mean, the immediate local effect of this sudden drop in oil prices is a massive boon for the Greek economy.
Yeah, so.
Well, cheaper oil immediately lowers the operating costs for their heavy industry, their transport networks, and their electricity generation.
So it fundamentally improves profit margins across the board and takes a tremendous amount of pressure off the national budget.
Precisely. And looking toward a horizon of 2030, this breathing room actually allows the Greek government to accelerate its investments in infrastructure and green energy.
Right, because when inflation isn't running hot, financing becomes cheaper. They can borrow money at better rates to build for the future.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. When I was going through the liberal.gr reporting on Greece and the broader EU-China trade war, I noticed an incredible paradox.
The shipping situation.
Yes. The European Union is currently trying to protect its domestic industry, so they are slapping hefty 50% tariffs on Chinese steel and aggressively regulating critical raw materials. You would assume a massive trade war would hurt a European economy like Greece, but according to the data, Greek shipping is actually thriving because of it. Am I reading this right? How is global trade friction making them money?
You are reading it right. It is a brilliant example of how economics always finds a loophole. While the EU is raising legislative walls, Greek ship owners are quietly capitalizing on the resulting market distortions.
Okay.
Right now, Greek orders make up an astonishing 46% of all tanker orders in Chinese shipyards.
Wait, almost half.
Almost half. They are buying up cheap Chinese shipbuilding capacity at record levels because the trade war has depressed certain domestic Chinese markets, making those ships an absolute bargain.
Okay, so they get the ships for cheaper. But tariffs disrupt normal trade routes. Doesn't that hurt the shipping business in the long run?
You'd think so, but the data actually shows the exact opposite, due to a concept in the shipping industry called ton miles.
Ton miles. Okay, explain that.
Imagine you run a pizza delivery business. If the main road is closed due to construction, your drivers have to take a longer, winding detour to reach the customer.
Right, which takes more gas and more time.
But in global shipping, you charge the customer for that extra distance.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. When geopolitical tensions or tariffs force ships to bypass traditional efficient routes and take longer alternative paths, the ton miles increase. That's the volume of cargo multiplied by the distance traveled. And an increase in ton miles means more revenue for the people who own the ships.
So the Greek shipping magnates are winning on both ends here. They're buying cheaper ships built in China and then getting paid more to sail them on longer, more complicated routes because of the trade war.
That is the pragmatic reality of global commerce. But, and this is a big but, the sources point out a very sharp counterpoint to this when we look at Greece's domestic future.
Right, specifically their green energy sector. Companies like Terna Energy and PPC Renewables are trying to build the sustainable infrastructure of tomorrow.
But they need the physical hardware to do it.
And they rely heavily on Chinese supply chains for that equipment, don't they?
Heavily. We are talking about solar inverters, lithium batteries, photovoltaic panels. China absolutely dominates the manufacturing of those green technologies globally.
Wait, I see the collision course here. The EU is slapping tariffs on China, and China historically retaliates with export controls on rare earth minerals. So what does that do to a wind farm project in Greece?
It creates a complete nightmare for their capital expenditures, their CapEx. When tariffs and export controls hit, the cost of the raw materials and the imported technology shoots through the roof.
Which actively hurts the return on investment for these green projects.
Exactly. The paradox is that the very same EU-China trade war that is wildly benefiting the Greek shipping industry is simultaneously crippling their domestic green energy transition.
It's a complete double-edged sword. And digging deeper into the export data in our sources, there's another hidden vulnerability for Greece. A staggering 40% of Greek exports to China are concentrated in just a single category.
Yeah, oil and bituminous minerals.
Right. And the sources note the category saw a 1,972% jump in 2025 alone. Before we analyze that, what actually is a bituminous mineral?
In simple terms, we are talking about heavy tar-like crude derivatives. Think of asphalt, road tar, and heavy industrial fuels. China requires massive amounts of this for their infrastructure development and heavy manufacturing.
So Greece is suddenly exporting a massive amount of this specific industrial material to China. But why is that a vulnerability? I mean, a 1,900% jump in exports sounds like a good thing.
It is a classic concentration risk. When 40% of your export economy to a major superpower is heavily skewed toward a single energy commodity, you are incredibly exposed. Remember what we just discussed about the U.S.-Iran conflict and the war premium?
Ah, I see. The price of those minerals is completely tied to global energy volatility.
Exactly. If the U.S. and Iran actually reach a lasting peace agreement and global oil prices permanently stabilize at a much lower rate, the value of that massive chunk of Greece's export revenue shrinks drastically overnight.
Wow.
It highlights why economic diversification isn't just a corporate buzzword. For a nation, it is a matter of profound national security.
Okay, so if Greece represents a country trying to delicately balance its economy between Western alliances and Chinese supply chains, Argentina is the ultimate global case study in what happens when extreme political ideology crashes headfirst into a brick wall of economic reality.
Oh, it really is. It's a masterclass in the limits of political rhetoric.
Let's look at Argentine President Javier Milei. He came into power fiercely aligned with the U.S. alt-right. His campaign rhetoric was basically scorched earth.
Very aggressive, yeah.
He openly grouped China with nations that lack democratic values. He pulled Argentina entirely out of the BRICS economic alliance, and he actively downgraded Argentina's involvement in the UN and global climate agreements like COP. He basically stood on a global stage and said, "We don't need China, we are looking entirely west."
And then the cold, hard macroeconomic numbers caught up with him.
They usually do.
Argentina has been facing a severe generational crisis. To give you a sense of scale, we are talking about a scenario where short-term interest rates previously hit an unfathomable 87%.
87%, which means businesses literally can't borrow money to operate, and regular citizens can't afford basic loans.
Furthermore, their foreign exchange reserves, which are the actual U.S. dollars the government holds to buy imported goods and stabilize their own currency, were completely depleted. The country was, for all intents and purposes, broke.
So despite all his fiery anti-communist rhetoric on the campaign trail, what did Milei actually do when faced with national bankruptcy?
Well, by June 2026, he had to quietly authorize negotiations with Beijing to renew a massive currency swap line worth 35 billion yuan.
Which is about 4.9 billion US dollars.
Right, extending it through July 2026.
Before we move on, explain how a currency swap actually works. Is China just handing Argentina a giant credit card? Why is this so crucial?
That's a pretty good analogy, actually.
yeah.
Essentially, yes. In a currency swap, China deposits billions of yuan into Argentina's central bank, and Argentina deposits an equivalent amount of pesos into China's central bank.
Okay.
But the key here is that it allows Argentina to pay for Chinese imports or pay off certain international debts using yuan instead of U.S. dollars.
Because they didn't have any dollars left.
Exactly. Since Argentina had run out of dollars, this swap line was quite literally the only thing keeping their economy from flatlining.
That is fascinating. And his tone toward China changed completely because of it, didn't it?
Night and day.
The sources mention a highly specific quote from Milei recently. He announced a January 2025 trip to China, and suddenly he's calling them, quote, A very interesting trading partner, because they don't demand anything, all they ask is not to be bothered. I mean, the rhetorical whiplash is just incredible.
It shows that when a country is facing sovereign default, alliances are determined by who can provide immediate liquidity, not who shares your political philosophy.
But the story doesn't end there, because Washington noticed this happening, right? The sources detail a major intervention by the U.S.
And this raises an important question about how modern superpowers compete. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the U.S., via Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, realized that China was gaining way too much leverage in Argentina.
Which is a country the U.S. views as strategically vital in the Western Hemisphere.
Exactly. So the U.S. executed a highly unusual, massive counterplay. The U.S. Treasury stepped in and provided a $20 billion lifeline to prop up Milei's government, which actually included directly buying Argentine pesos.
Wait, I need you to break that down. How exactly does a foreign government buy a distressed currency to prop up a regime?
It's a form of foreign exchange intervention. By using U.S. dollars to buy billions of Argentine pesos on the open market, the U.S. Treasury artificially increases the demand for the peso.
Right, supply and demand.
Yeah. This stabilizes the peso's value, preventing hyperinflation from getting worse, and pumps desperately needed U.S. dollars directly into Argentina's central bank.
So the U.S. essentially injected cash to buy time for Milei's domestic economic reforms to work. But primarily, it was to box China out of the region. They are literally fighting a geopolitical war with checkbooks instead of tanks.
That's the pragmatic reality of modern statecraft, and this financial tug-of-war is directly affecting specific, on-the-ground infrastructure projects. The nuclear pivot in Argentina is the clearest example of this in our sources.
Let's talk about that, because looking toward a 2030 horizon, energy independence is everything.
It is. Under the previous administration, Argentina had been deep in negotiations for a massive nuclear power project called Hualong 1. This was being built with China, under the umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative.
But Milei scrapped it.
He did. Due to structural issues, mounting fears of a Chinese debt trap, and intense diplomatic pressure from the U.S., Milei scrapped the Chinese project. Instead, he is now prioritizing a domestic, U.S.-backed, small modular reactor, the ACR-300, aiming for a 2030 commissioning.
So let me just synthesize this. Milei takes the Chinese currency swap to financially survive today, but he signs the long-term nuclear energy deal with the U.S. to secure tomorrow.
Yep.
It is deeply, ruthlessly pragmatic.
And it completely contradicts everything he said on the campaign trail. It proves our central thesis, economics always wins the argument.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We are talking about the U.S. and China buying currencies, countries playing superpowers off each other to fund their power grids. It paints a picture of a world where traditional cooperative diplomacy is just, well, breaking down.
It is. The Carnegie Report in our sources highlights this as a broader, somewhat alarming global trend heading into 2030. They call it the slow death of multilateralism.
The slow death of multilateralism.
We are entering what the Carnegie researchers term a new old era. Think about the post-World War II international system. Institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the whole idea of a rules-based global order.
Right.
That system has reached its limits. We are seeing a return to a world where the law of the strong dictates the terms, rather than international committees.
Meaning countries are ditching the big global roundtables where everyone gets a vote in favor of backroom one-on-one deals where the richest country dictates the terms.
Precisely. Leaders like Donald Trump in the U.S. and Javier Milei in Argentina view multilateral organizations with deep suspicion. They often see them as bureaucratic constraints on their national sovereignty.
So they heavily favor direct, leader-to-leader bilateral deals and ideological alignments over broad regional coordination.
Yeah, and looking at the academic studies on the Belt and Road Initiative, China has been incredibly savvy at navigating this new old era. They seem to have perfected transactional diplomacy. China has developed a highly tailored soft power strategy over the last decade. They have systematically identified and leveraged the economic vulnerabilities of smaller nations. Let's look back at Greece for a second.
Okay.
When Greece was in the absolute depths of its sovereign debt crisis and the European Union was demanding harsh, punishing austerity measures, China stepped in with cash and bought a controlling stake in the Piraeus port.
They offered a lifeline when the traditional allies were offering a lecture.
Exactly. And we see this in Central Europe as well. China built a very tight bilateral economic relationship with Hungary, just pouring in investment. And the return on that investment, Hungary now actively uses its veto power within the European Union to block joint statements criticizing Beijing.
Oh, wow. It's entirely transactional. Like, I buy your port or fund your factories, and you block the UN resolution against me.
That's exactly it.
But this raises a huge question. If international law is taking a backseat to pure economic leverage, how do smaller or more vulnerable countries protect themselves heading into 2030? How do they avoid just being bought and sold on the open market by Washington and Beijing?
The synthesis from the Carnegie research provides a clear roadmap, and it comes down to building institutional resilience.
Okay, what does that look like?
First, the responsibility actually falls on Western nations. They have to offer real, viable economic alternatives. You cannot just lecture a developing country in South America or Africa about the dangers of Chinese debt trap diplomacy if you aren't willing to offer them a better, fairer loan yourself.
Right, you can't tell a starving man not to eat the only sandwich on the table just because you don't like the guy who made it.
That's a perfect way to put it. And on the flip side, the vulnerable states themselves must build incredibly strong, transparent domestic regulatory frameworks.
So they can't be easily bought?
Right. They have to demand total transparency in public contracts. They must actively root out crony capitalism, where local political elites sell out national strategic assets to foreign powers just for short-term personal wealth or political survival.
Yeah.
If your domestic institutions are weak or corrupt, you will be exploited by this new bilateral reality.
So to summarize this incredibly complex journey we've been on today for you, we started by looking at the immediate market relief of paused airstrikes in the Middle East. We saw the mechanics of how a single geopolitical pause can evaporate the war premium on oil, drop prices, and give central banks a weapon to fight inflation.
Yeah, that initial domino.
Right. And then we explored how that volatile reality forces complex compromises for a country like Greece, where they are brilliantly exploiting the EU-China trade war for their shipping industry, while simultaneously watching that same trade war cripple their green energy transition due to supply chain monopolies.
And we saw the ultimate real-world application of this in Argentina, where a fiercely right-wing president was forced by the sheer weight of 87% interest rates in bankruptcy to quietly embrace Beijing's currency swaps, only to have the U.S. rush in with a $20 billion liquidity injection to win him back.
At every single level, the fiery political ideology is just window dressing. The cold, hard economic machinery operating in the background is what is actually steering global policy.
Every single time.
Which brings us to a final lingering thought for you to mull over as we wrap up today. We are watching the U.S. and China directly buying foreign currencies, funding massive strategic infrastructure projects, and bailing out central banks just to secure geopolitical loyalty.
Yeah.
We know that modern kinetic warfare, as we see constantly threatening to boil over in the Middle East, is becoming too costly, too globally destructive, and too economically unpredictable. So we have to ask ourselves, are we entering an era where the next world war won't be fought with missiles, aircraft carriers, and tanks?
It's a terrifying thought.
Will it be fought entirely on the balance sheets of central banks? Will the ultimate weapon of 2030 simply be the interest rate?
It completely forces us to redefine what a battlefield actually looks like in the 21st century.
The next time you watch a politician giving a fiery speech or read a headline about a sudden diplomatic pivot, look past the podium. Look for the economic machinery operating beneath the noise, because that is where the real decisions are being made. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, and we will see you next time.